Perfect.
Hello, my name is Maria Fernanda Florescano Montiel, EdTech Entrepreneurship Manager at Tecnológico de Monterrey, and it is my privilege and pleasure on behalf of Teclabs, our educational innovation laboratory, and the Innovative Entrepreneurship Zone of the Institute of Entrepreneurship, Eugenio Garza Lagüera, to welcome you here today. As you know, over the last month, we have invited key stakeholders in the education sector and the community at large to join us in a series of webinars focused on the disruption of education after COVID-19. The response we received from people all over the world has been extraordinary, which is why, with a sense of humble gratitude, that we draw this series to a close with the webinar title, The Education of the Future and the Future of Education, the Educational Landscape Beyond COVID-19. Our goal today is to get a better idea of the road we traveled in recent years and of the crossroads ahead of us to plan and prepare for the future while building the education of the future. With this in mind, we are honored by your presence and that of our distinguished panelists, Barbara Kirschen, Patrick Brothers, and Diana Incapié, who will first engage in a discussion on the issue at hand and then answer some of the questions you submit via the Q&A section of this webinar. We'll address as many questions as we have time for, but rest assured, we won't ignore the questions we can get to. Our team will make sure they are routed to educational innovation experts of Tecnológico de Monterrey. So feel free to share your inquiries at any time throughout the webinar. Well then, without further ado, I am honored to introduce you to our panelists this evening. Dr. Barbara Kirschen is Senior Fellow and Innovation Advisor at the Graduate School of Education of the University of Pennsylvania, in addition to serving on the board of several education and edtech companies. Throughout her career, Bobby has honored her vision of what can be using technology while supporting the growth of new education companies and developing innovative software products. Among the positions she has held in the past to pursue this vision are President of EduCorp Consultants Corporation, Executive Vice President of WorldSage, Executive Director of Curriki, Co-CEO of Core Learning, and Chief Academic Officer of Big Chalk. Patrick Brothers' professional background is equally noteworthy. He is the co-founder and managing director at HolonIQ, a global market intelligence platform for education, as well as a long-standing member of the B20 Education and Employment Task Force. In addition to HolonIQ, Patrick has founded several startups, including Packbase and Rush Labs. Furthermore, prior to HolonIQ, Patrick held a variety of senior appointments in mission-focused public and private sectors, among which are Chief Executive Officer of Navitas Ventures, Chief Development Officer at Navitas and CIMIC, Director at Deloitte in Corporate Strategy, and Officer in the Australian Army. Last but not least, joining us this evening is Dr. Diana Incapié, economist at the Education Division of the Inter-American Development Bank, who leads research projects related to improving the quality of education, skills development, teachers' policy, early childhood development, and the extended school day. The latter, while working in the design and implementation of impact evaluations of education programs and policies, and supporting the IDB's operations and technical cooperation work in Latin America and the Caribbean. In her extensive professional career, Diana has worked for the IDB's research department, the World Bank's Poverty and Gender Unit in Washington, D.C., and the Center of Economic Development Studies at Los Andes University in Bogota, Colombia. Patrick, Barbara, Diana, thank you for joining us. To begin our conversation on the puzzling and complex issue that is the focus of today's discussion, I would like to ask you to briefly answer the following question. What is education and what is its ultimate purpose in the broad sense? Diana, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Maria Fernanda, and thank you so much to Teclabs and to Tecnológico de Monterrey for inviting me to this discussion. I feel very, very pleased and very honored to have the opportunity to talk to you today about education and the future of education. So let me start with the question, with the trigger question that you just made, which is what's the purpose of education? I'm honored actually to start the conversation with these questions because it seems sometimes a little bit obvious, but it's actually a very complex question. So I will make it a two-part answer, and that is because I think the education is that main tool, of course, that societies have to help people develop all their capacities and skills in order to reach their full potential. So I think it has an individual purpose in supporting the skill development of individuals. Of course, it is well known that for an individual, education promotes employment, promotes earnings, promotes a better health, civic participation, and a lot of other positive things for the individual. It also improves the possibilities that individuals have to get into a labor market, and especially to adapt to a changing labor market. But I think most importantly, at least for me, at the individual level, education is a tool for social mobility. And I think especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, the area where I work, the region where I work, there are so many inequalities and gaps in education. And I think education is a tool in order to reduce those inequalities. And of course, the other part of the answer is at the society level. What's the purpose of education for a society? Of course, it's a powerful driver of economic development. It has an enormous potential to reduce poverty levels, to reduce inequalities at the societal level. So it's a very, very powerful equalizer for a society. So I think, like, in those two dimensions, of course, education plays a very, very important role.
Thank you, Diana, for sharing this multi-purpose perspective. Barbara, Patrick, is there anything you would like to add? Can you offer a different view?
I agree with what you said, Diana. I think it's true. But I do think that as we look at the future of education, we have to consider what's happening in the world today and how that will change education, and how we're going to see an acceleration of technologies. We're going to see an acceleration of student agency and how they're learning, and what role the teacher will play and how the teacher will play that. I think we're going to see much more looking at what upskilling and their skills they're going to need to survive and stay. And more importantly, I think we're going to see a change in the way people teach and the way the people in the profession think about learning, whether it's at the early stage or whether it's in high school or in college or in adult learning in corporations. Because 70% of the faculty members, when colleges went remote in like a week, had never been online. And of that 70%, probably 90% didn't even know what Zoom was. And we're talking about low-level technology here. So I think the future of education will be dramatically changed by the experience we're going through today.
I think, just to add to both of those, even the word education is loaded for all of us with such a predetermined definition of models and expectations. And I find it fascinating that some are even choosing to try not to even use the word education. Like, there's so much more usage of learning and teaching and skills and the like. And that's a deliberate attempt to try and free us from bias and preconceived ideas about what that is. But it was wonderful how Diana kind of defined that, because an education it's relevant to countries, to the same definitions. Countries achieving their potential, countries achieving prosperity, organizations unleashing the potential of the people in them, and families as well. Back to the heart of, we're all trapped with our immediate family and connecting with our other, but education is such an important part of that family prosperity and social mobility, as Diana talked about. So it is such a fascinating thing that we even return to what is education to us, and especially in such an uncertain time about what it was and what it might be.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, Diana, Bobby. That was really interesting. I love that I could hear you talk about education beyond schooling or instruction or the act of training, because education, as Diana was saying, is so much more than that, and it has the potential to become so much more, as Bobby was saying. But before we talked about the future of education, because the past is closely linked to the present and the latter influences the future, I want to ask Bobby, What has been the most profound and significant changes in the educational sector and the teaching and learning practices in the last decade?
It's an interesting question because I go way back and did my doctoral dissertation on how kids learn using computers. And we're talking about a long time ago. I won't give you the numbers, but it's long. And at the time, I remember when the CD-ROM, you are probably too young, but the CD-ROM was come into play, and Apple actually had only 20% of their computers being produced with that CD-ROM. And we're talking about maybe 10 programs on CD-ROM, the most famous being a reading program. And they flipped their 80 and 20% overnight to change the way they were going to distribute their Macintoshes at the time. And so that was a profound change in learning and teaching. The second one that I think is profound was the introduction of the internet. The ability for the internet to become a place that you could actually learn and you could actually share information. And then, of course, following closely with that was Google, the ability to search the internet. I can't think of anything that we don't do, that we don't go, whether it's Google or lots of different search engines, but Google sort of become synonymous with the word Kleenex when you think about tissues. So we search the internet, and most of us probably, as soon as somebody asks you a question, you pick up your phone and you say, oh, the answer is, that kind of thing. So that would be profound. And then the fourth thing that I think is really profound has been mobile. The ability to bring to the classroom, and worldwide, everybody has a mobile phone. They may not have a computer, they may not have internet, but they have a cell connection. And one of my personal projects is working in refugee camps to provide mobile learning on their phones to teach English, the local language, and computer coding. And this is and everybody has a phone. Now, they don't have a lot of access, but we can make it asynchronous. We can make it downloaded. But I think mobile learning will change the way we think. We carry our learning with us. We learn just in time. So as I look going to the future of what I think will be profound, and of course, Patrick can give you more of the numbers and data on this, but I think you're going to see a great use of AI and virtual reality as we move into experience. I'll just give you two quick examples of why I see this happening. The first is I had a conversation with a good friend the other day who heads up Warner Brothers themed parks. And they're all closed. Disneyland just opened, I think, in Japan again in a very socially distanced way. But he was telling me that they're looking for new ways to use their parks. And I said, well, why don't we come up with an ability to use those parks for experiential learning that kids can be dropped in through virtual reality? And he was very excited about it. They have these parks, they have education. And 20 years ago when we introduced edutainment, it was pretty bad. So I want to make sure we don't do the same thing again. But I do see that we're going to see more and better merging of media and education and learning. And the second thing that I think another example is that I think we're going to see more examples of things that allow you to learn in smaller pieces and stack degrees. So you won't need a degree from college. You're going to see a lot of stackable experiences. And I hope all of us on this panel and all the many people listening will remember that we have lots of solutions today. As you pointed out earlier before, Maria, you have been tracking all of the ed tech startups in Latin America, and you have hundreds of them. Patrick's been tracking them around the world. And many of them have lots of good solutions. They don't have a problem they're solving for. So I want to make sure that when we build these new solutions and what becomes profound in the future, we'll have problems that they'll solve. So.
Thank you, Bobby. That was actually a very interesting perspective. And I want to hear Patrick's and Diana's point of view on this, because I do understand what you're saying about these problems that need solving and all of these solutions that are available, also how we've evolved over time and where we're going. So please, Diana, Patrick, you have the floor.
Yeah, so let me give you the perspective from Latin America, because I think, of course, the situation is very different there. And I love, Bobby, that you ended up talking about what's the problem. And actually in Latin America, we are a little bit lagging behind many other regions and other countries in the world. And so what we see in Latin America, at least in terms of teaching, is, we still have very inadequate classroom practices, very low content knowledge from teachers, very old pedagogical methods, outdated, just, characterized by repetition and memorization and practice. And unfortunately, not a very meritocratic teacher career. So I think there are like a lot of structural problems in the teaching profession in Latin America, which actually are very challenging when you start thinking about technological solutions. So on the positive side, what we see also in Latin America is that many countries have moved in the right directions, and they have, tried to professionalize a little bit more the teaching profession and start training teachers for the new technologies, for the new realities. But let me just mention a second challenge that I see in this also for the Latin American region, is of course the issue of access. And I think that has been particularly evident during the pandemic. Most kids don't have access to a laptop, to a tablet, and even worse, to an internet connection. And that's particularly a problem for the most vulnerable children living in rural areas, living in poor families and backgrounds. So I see a lot of these things coming faster to the US and to other more developed countries. Of course, there are a lot of, technological innovations in Latin America and in other developing countries. But I think there's still an issue, in terms of providing access, first of all, to everyone, a good, internet connection to start, but also, software, hardware, tablets, computers. And then to complement that, having the right teacher training and support for schools and even for parents so that they can take advantage of all these technologies. And in most Latin American countries, yes, you see AI taking a role, VR, having an important role, at least for some parts of the student body. But I think there's still a long way to go in order for this to be massive and to provide opportunities, especially for the most vulnerable populations.
Patrick, you've gathered a lot of data, as Bobby was mentioning, from solutions, educational solutions from around the world. And I know that you've recently released a report on Latin American edtech startups. So can you tell us a little bit about the solutions that are being built on the region and how can they address these problems that Diana was mentioning?
Yeah, I think that I think that it's easy to take the side of the fence, which is what many who are not from the sector take, is they're quite critical of education not changing. So, you framed this question as a decade, and they would, a popular opinion would be education hasn't changed in a century, let alone a decade. But that many of those folks are disconnected from the teachers and the learners, and education is such an important and profound thing. It's important it doesn't change to the extent it disconnects us from the learning process. And so, and I just want to pick on a couple of things that Bobby and Diana raised. I think one thing we've done really poorly is define the problem. And I think this returns to your first question, which is we frame it in a incremental improvement of a predefined rigid system. And we're not creative enough at defining the problem the way, or the challenge the way Diana did. If we had a room full of experts and said, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we bring all the innovation and the opportunity. I mean, one of the biggest trends we've seen is the re-emergence or the emergence of peer-to-peer, of coaching and mentoring. We spend a lot of time searching for experts to share content, and we forget that there are incredible opportunities for talent and for skills and knowledge from the people around us, like take away computers and Google and all those sorts of things. Like there's no substitute for me of sitting next to someone who has achieved mastery in something and them sharing that knowledge with me. And I didn't have to pay a fancy institution for that knowledge or skills, and it was personalized to the extent it was still human. And we see a lot of that commentary in terms of pedagogy and learning and teaching as well, as how do we help our teachers fulfill a role as a mentor and a coach, as much as they are at structuring pedagogy and learning as well. So yeah, I mean, early childhood as well. I think a lot of the world is waking up to those early years before primary education are not just childcare. They're actually really important, really critical moments in an adult's learning. The World Bank published a study last year or the year before that talked about how the actual delta in knowledge and skills was higher in early childhood than it was in higher education. You know, if you forget about those years, you're really, and we're seeing Asian parents are really jumping onto that trend. There's language learning for 3-year-olds in China now. Like they haven't learned Mandarin yet, and they're learning English.
Well, it's
so,
interesting. Go ahead.
sorry, Bobby.
No, I was just going to say, it's very interesting, Diana and Patrick, that we are seeing this inequity, the digital inequity that's going on around the world, and that people have made come up with solutions that don't require technology. However, they are consciously aware that even in the most rural parts of the world, people have access to their mobile phone, and in the refugee camps where I'm doing the project that I'm doing. However, some of the best projects I've seen globally don't require technology and do use peer-to-peer learning. Certainly, the project in Colombia being run by Vicky Colbert, Escuela Nuevo is a good example of that. The Computer in the Wall projects in India is a good example of that. So there are lots of projects where technology has become the catalyst for learning or the catalyst for the sharing, but not essential to the learning. So I think if we don't raise the bar and say we're going to change our pedagogies to assume that eventually not everybody in the world has a telephone today, not everybody in the world has a TV, but I've been in some pretty remote areas and personally for travel and work, and I walk into villages, they may not even have running water, but they have television in their homes, or they have a radio, or so the technology will be there. So I don't think I think we raise the bar high enough that we service the people where they are today, but our goal is to service them where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years. Because if we start servicing today, we're basically putting a stop to innovation and change.
And I love that you just mentioned that, because you just set the perfect scenario for my next question, which I'm gonna direct to Patrick. You actually mentioned that if we had a room full of people and we could think about, what is the education that we want to see in the future? What is it that we need? Which are the problems that need to be addressed? And so, because we've already talked about the purpose of education in the broad sense, we've discussed some of the recent developments in the sector and the educational practice, as well as the role of technology in the sector and in the educational practices. And where do you think education is headed, and where should it be headed to serve the purpose of education and meet the needs of current and future generations?
Yeah, what a question.
You got the easy one, Patrick.
I think, so I have some thoughts because 2 years ago, nearly to the month, we did a massive piece of work we called Education in 2030. Inspired by the OECD work on education in 2030, but again with another macro lens. And we came up with 5 scenarios that were not intended to describe 5 different outcomes, but were 5 extremes, acknowledging that the future will be a blend of different. And those scenarios were, very briefly, education as usual, which was sadly not much innovation and not much progress, and if anything, an entrenchment into the way we think about it today. Regional rising, which described, say, in a Latin American context, more collaboration across the region, more cross-country talent sharing, accreditation, mobility, teacher training and the like. And so tackling these challenges as a region, as most countries struggle to afford education as a system themselves. And so there's this opportunity to collaborate. The third scenario was global giants, which described the scenario of, large technology incumbents or even large higher education institutions consolidating and delivering education at more of a giant level. The fourth scenario was peer-to-peer, which was education following the disintermediation that we see in some other industries of the, in inverted commas, the middleman, the institution being displaced by connectivity between peers who help each other learn. And the final was an AI-inspired scenario called Robo-Revolution, which was not about displacing teachers. It's actually about harnessing artificial intelligence for that first mile of response, the Q&A that is repetitive, that is the base level, that gets you to the point where a teacher can take you to mastery. What was fascinating about these scenarios and sharing them we had about 4,000 people around the world sharing their preferences and where they thought they would head is, at the time, this is pre-COVID, I'm sure it's changed now, 50% of people still thought we would be education as usual in 2030. 5% of people actually preferred that scenario, but 50% of people still thought, and that said a lot about our entrenched incumbent thinking about where education was heading. The most popular scenario by far in terms of preference was peer-to-peer. And I'm talking like 2/3 of respondents. And the way we always framed the question was, if you're a professor, take that hat off and put on a parent or a learner hat. If you're trying to secure your own social mobility, economic security, knowledge and creativity, and there was this incredible appetite for peer-to-peer. And then there was a spread. In Europe, there was a very, very low level of preference and tolerance for global giants. There was, whereas in the US or say in China, there was a little bit more, but, trust is degrading in some of those giant institutions across society as well. And so I suspect that has changed. I think we did a big survey around COVID, but it was at the start of March. It was as we knew we were being, we were moving into an unprecedented time, but we perhaps didn't know the scale or the impact of what was happening. And we're still a little bit loath to make any predictions or share it. We think we're still in the thing. We're not out of it looking back. And so we're still a little nervous about trying to, we're always nervous about trying to predict the future, but more nervous than before. But, there's lots of different ways that education could evolve. I think we're all hoping that this is a positive prompt for positive inspired change. It's not a rapid return to usual, and it's not a knee-jerk to more solutions that don't have well-defined problems. So hopefully some of that makes sense.
Still, I do believe that it's important, even though, of course, as you mentioned, it's hard to predict the future. I think it's important to think about where should we be headed? What is the education that we need? Because one thing is where the industry is headed, and that is maybe difficult to think about right now, where everything is just still inside this COVID-19 world. But I want to hear what Bobby, if you could answer this, I want to hear what you think is the education that we need to serve the future generations.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think we're ever going to be able to keep up with the content. As Diana earlier said, the content is just so out of control in education. So I think we need to look at the skills that you need to learn independently, to learn peer-to-peer, and to learn in collaborative environments both online and offline. And I think those skills include things that we haven't yet taught kids to be independent learners, to learn how to find the information, to learn how to solve problems. We teach a lot of facts, and that's the old pedagogy. We teach kids to memorize things that they're never going to use. And maybe there's some problem solving skills in learning a set of facts that you could use, but we don't need to memorize all the presidents of the United States or all the capitals of the states anymore, because I can just bring them up on my phone instantaneously. And even if I don't have access to the internet today, there's, even in rural areas, there's the one child that's sharing that one computer or that one phone or that one access. So kids are learning in collaborative experiences. So we need to do more problem-based and project-based learning. We need to do more experience with the peer-to-peer learning, as Patrick was pointing out. And we need to be clear to the education and educators when we train teachers that we're teaching you to teach kids to learn and how to facilitate that. We're not teaching you how to teach history. Yes, there are some skills that will make you a better history teacher, and we'll encourage you to teach those skills. So I'm not suggesting we throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm suggesting we flip the pyramid and decide that we teach teachers to teach other people to learn. And right now we're having a major problem in teacher colleges, for example. In the United States, and I'm sure all over the world, we have requirements that require teachers to be student teachers, and they have to go into classrooms. Well, today they can't go into classrooms. The states haven't caught up with changing that. So now we have a whole group of teachers that need to get the skills to teach online, not what they teach online, but how to teach online. We have states and counties that have a different set of criteria to become a certified teacher. And colleges of education have nobody on their faculty that's ever taught online. So now we're expecting them to be the experts to teach online. And this, by the way, is just one subject area that has this problem. This is true in medical schools. This is true in law schools. This is true in teaching computer science. Now, at least technology is a little bit easier to move online because you're doing everything online to learn. And I've seen great experience. So I want to make sure we're teaching people to teach how to teach to learn, and not what they teach, because we can get the information. We have to understand the pedagogy.
And actually, I know, Diana, that you have done a lot of research both in the skills of the future and teachers' pedagogy. So can you give us your point of view on what Bobby was saying?
Yeah, I totally agree with Bobby, especially your last part. I was gonna say, imagine if that's happening in teacher colleges in the US. Imagine how this is, going on in Latin American countries. As I mentioned before, that the initial training that teachers receive is very outdated, and they don't even have access to actual classrooms before they graduate most of the times. So imagine these guys graduate from teacher training programs, and they have to go the next day to teach something that they haven't heard at all. No? I am a little bit optimistic that maybe as we change a little bit the generation, also that will help accelerate that learning process. But the truth right now is that we have all these very outdated teacher training programs. And let me add one additional thing, because I'm very concerned about inequality. This is an issue everywhere in the world, but in Latin America, very, very persistent and strong. And is the large inequities that students actually have in accessing high quality teachers. Because of the way in which teachers are, selected and allocated to schools. Of course, students in rural schools and vulnerable urban areas end up having the worst teachers that probably haven't even finished a teacher training program. And so, of course, that accentuates even more the large achievement gaps. And let me just finish by saying that, going back to Patrick's point before, I think technology also provides these opportunities. I think it's challenging, to have access and to take advantage of technologies for all students. But I think actually for teachers, it works really well, or at least has the potential to work really well. So I think there's also an opportunity to use technology, to provide appropriate teacher training. And I agree with Bobby, it's not about content, but just like training them on how they should teach and what are the right pedagogies and teaching methods. And let me just add something else, because this is something that we have been working at the ITV very recently, and is because of this problem of how teachers are allocated in Latin America and the Caribbean. There is also an opportunity to use technology to improve that process. So we are working with several countries in the region to use AI just to improve the quality of the algorithm that is used to allocate teachers to schools. And that seems to be, something that looks so very complicated to many, but actually provides opportunities for the most vulnerable children to have access to better quality teachers. So I think there's a lot of space in there to use technology to improve the quality of teaching, but also to improve the allocation of teachers to different students and different schools.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Bobby. Now it's time to briefly answer some questions from our audience. And a lot of them are focused on keeping this balance that you were mentioning. How can we use technology, but also keep us humanized, don't humanize education. And, there's a fine line there. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. How can we implement technology in education and still make sure that we are catering to people that, as we've been mentioned throughout this panel, do not have access to technology? And also, how can we make sure that while integrating technology, we can keep it humanized? I'm sorry if I'm making myself, I hope I'm making myself clear.
No, I mean, I might jump in, Maria. I mean, the most exciting technologies that I see are actually about the humans, about verifying a human's skills, for example. Like, one of the things that we do really badly as humans is we bring bias, we bring loaded, preconceived stereotypes about people and I mean, when we introduce people, we talk about the institutions they've been to, we talk about brands. That's social capital. That's one side. We don't talk about skills. And so it's kind of no surprise that you should be able to walk into a random village in an underdeveloped economy and you will find people with incredible skills. But because they haven't been credentialed by a luxury brand, as society and as humans, there's plenty of studies. We are terrible at hiring people based off those non-science. Technology has its own challenges in that respect, for sure. We've seen that with artificial intelligence biasing certain parts. But technology is a very interesting and novel way at approaching that problem as well. And I know we keep returning to it, but I'm excited about how technology can help us connect with each other as humans. And in that idea of, if I want to acquire a skill, it's a really difficult process. And I start by looking for institutions. And again, I'm loaded in thinking about brand and social capital. I'm probably surrounded by a whole bunch of people who are in the building next door or down the street, or a family who can help me acquire that skill in a really human way, and probably a really low cost way compared to other alternatives. So yeah, the most exciting technologies I see are actually about magnifying, amplifying, connecting people, and teachers as well. Diana and Bobby have talked a lot about this, and there's such an opportunity to support our teachers in so many different ways with technology. I just feel like we've let ourselves down, not codifying the problems and communicating them as clearly as we should, so that all these people who are excited about bringing these solutions to market are are guided by us into the ones which will have the maximum impact.
I think where Patrick's pointed out a very important thing. To humanize, we also have to address the question of bias, both bias against women. Congratulations to this panel, 3 women and 1 man. So, and also diversity. And so as we look at changing what we do and who has the skills, universities and brands are going to become quite different. I just published a blog yesterday on Forbes, and I mentioned this problem of universities now. Students are saying, well, I don't need to pay $75,000 to go to an Ivy League or to go to Oxford or go to Cambridge at their, whatever they're charging, not as much as the US, but I can go to the local community college and learn online because I'm not getting the brand professor for every course I take online at Penn. I'm getting the really good professor, but not the one that gets written up in the Wall Street Journal from Wharton. So we're going to see a change in more people teaching what they're skilled at. I mean, I have addressed this question many times because Penn won't let me hire anybody to teach in my master's program who doesn't already have a master's degree. And we've kind of played the game to make sure we don't do that. But on the other hand, I've been able to create this thing called entrepreneurial, and they're my best teachers. And some of them don't even have college degrees. Some of them have undergraduate, but not master's degrees. And they've done amazing things, but we can't hire them as a faculty member because they don't meet this kind of criteria. So as we look at what's changing due to the movement to online, the changing in the issue around racism all over the world, we're going to see a change in the way we think about who teaches, when they teach, and what the criteria is for being the teacher or the peer. And it's going to change, I think, dramatically what young people are doing. Many of my friends that have college students have already told me that and we're talking about kids going to MIT and Stanford and Harvard and things like that. They're not going back to school full time in the fall because they don't want to be online for a full-time class anymore. So they're going to be half of the time working or doing other things. And we have an election coming up. A lot of them are volunteering for the election. So I think what Patrick's saying is really important about who is the teacher and who's the learner, and what criteria do we have and expect of those people.
And let me just rephrase the last question. And there was a few problems in there. So I guess what people are asking is, now that we discussed a little bit about the integration of technology and making sure that it does not dehumanize education, I want to ask you, how do you think we can move forward integrating technology in communities that lacked internet access or the hardware at this moment? What can we do as a society to help them move towards the access to these incredible edtech solutions that, I mean, Bobby, you've seen, Patrick, you work with them. So how can we move towards that goal?
Well, I think that's why I put mobile learning as my first profound thing that's going to change. I think mobile learning is going to change the way we think about learning and when we learn and how we learn. And I think that will be ubiquitous. I go into remote African villages, I go into refugee camps, and in refugee camps, they get whatever the local currency is, but equivalent of maybe $80 a month, and they can use that for whatever they want. 90% of it they use to use their data on their phone to learn, to send money home, to keep in touch with their families. So I think mobile learning, we're just seeing the very, very tip of what mobile learning is going to be able to do in changing devices. The other thing you're seeing is as we move away from telephone lines and we move more and more to the mobile cellular towers, everybody's going to have access, and we're going to see that as the way of the future. So I am not as worried about I'd love to solve the problem of everybody having access today. So I'm not as worried about access today because I think the speed at which that change is going to occur is going to be faster than we've ever seen before. And yes, there will still be pockets without it, but I think we're going to have a global revolution in who has access. and when they have access, and much faster than we would have before the pandemic.
Yes.
I
And
mean, in
Diana,
the US, for example, the states are distributing hotspots into schools in rural areas, hotspots to people that don't have access to the internet. And so they're using the money that they would have used for something else to make sure their kids can get on, because they realized as soon as everybody went online, it was an equitable solution. So I think the technology is at the tip of the iceberg about what we're going to be able to do for access.
and
I think,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Patrick.
sorry, Maria. I was just going to say, I think it's the work that Diana described that she's doing with governments, I think is actually a really, really critical part. I think knowledge, capacity building, some of those governments are their own worst enemy, but some of them don't know what they don't know as well. And I think that education has traditionally and is still principally a public service, and governments are struggling. They're really struggling. But some of that is knowledge, talent, capacity building. So I think certainly we're trying to work out how do we support governments better? How do we educate them in not a scary technology transformation way, but back to basics? And your question was doing this without technology, and some of, a lot of ministers jump from industry to industry in terms of their portfolio, and they don't know education and the nuances of it. And so how do you get someone up to speed really quickly on, what the problems are? I suppose it's back to that thing, is actually codifying the problems and being a little bit more imaginative about how we might solve those challenges. So it's so obvious to us that it's such an important issue. Many of the things we talked about, racism, diversity, like education is how we're gonna progress, And it's at the base level. It's our kids, what they're exposed to, what we're teaching them, how we, what our actions and what they follow. So yeah, definitely no more an important time. And that's not a big hyperbole about COVID. Just don't waste a good crisis, they say. And, people are using this as an opportunity to inflect and to reflect. So our work is super important.
And actually, Patrick was saying that you have the chance to work with governments and with, additionally to working with companies, tech companies, educational companies, established educational institutions. So I want to know, how can we as a global community help transform education? With your experience, what you've done so far, how you've collaborated and helped facilitate collaboration between all these stakeholders in the educational sector, how do you think we can help that transformation?
I don't think that's an easy question. And we can't even get our governments to collaborate on how much oil they produce or other sort of dramatic things in the world. But I think everybody is coming to the conclusion, and some of the people in the chat have mentioned this. I think we're coming to the conclusion that what's happening in our world is so dramatically changed by the last 4 months or 5 months, and they're all using television, radio to communicate. And so I think we're likely to be more collaborative around education than we have been in the past, that we will share technologies that are working. We will make internet more accessible. We will follow other countries that are setting up internet tools for people that haven't been able to get access or can't afford it. I think it's a governmental policy change that's not going to happen easily. One of the things I have been following is all the presidential candidates before we've kind of finalized on the 2 that will run. But I was following their education policy people just to see what they were writing about. And it was very interesting that these were all Democrats, obviously, because there was the only competition going on. But I think they all were promoting a more collaborative approach and between states. And like Australia, our states are independent of what they do for education. Our National Department of Education basically hands out money and makes suggested policy. It really can't control what the states do. So I think we're talking about a long upheaval to do that. But I think we're going to see, as you saw in the last week around the disruption on the protests, I think you're going to see a bottom-up swell of change that's going to be demanded by the people that don't have it.
Perfect, Bobby. Thank you. Diana, could you compliment Bobby's answer?
Yes, one thing that I wanted to say is that I'm a little bit less optimistic than Bobby in terms of how fast, you know, we can get access to a lot of students rapidly, but I'm optimistic for the last few months, actually, because something that has taken some countries 20 years to do, they have done it in a few months. Not only in terms of, you know, providing broadband access or you know, hardware, tablets, etc., but a lot of things that were impossible to do before, probably because of politics. And not because of, you know, institutional or structural problems, but more because of politics. The pandemic and the situation right now has kind of forced them to leapfrog and to avoid all those obstacles that they had before and make a lot of a lot of changes really fast. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that what has happened in the last few months has shown many countries that they can do it, that it's not totally a matter of I don't have enough budget, or I don't have the resources, or I don't have the knowledge, as Patrick was mentioning before. Sometimes it was just a matter of, you know, getting things done and being able to collaborate and to talk to other countries and to talk to private providers. So, for example, in Latin America, in the first week of lockdown, most of our countries had already, you know, contacted television providers, radio providers that had very, you know, useful and productive educational tools to start, you know, providing to their students. So I think there's a point to be optimistic there, in that change can happen, and it could happen more fast than we think. But let me just wrap up by going to the basics, because you are asking us to think about how we can help transform education. And I think, as Patrick mentioned before, that goes beyond technology, because at the end, technology, what does is improve all these connections and relationships. So to me, there are a few things that are important and that need to happen, at least in Latin America. First of all, as I mentioned, helping countries improve the teaching profession, attracting more qualified candidates, training them better, motivating them, and keeping them in the system when they are high quality teachers. Also, the topic of content, having an appropriate curriculum, especially right now when we are going to have students going in different shifts and they are not going to spend the same amount of time in the classroom. What type of things are we prioritizing? In Latin America, kids have 10, 15 different subjects sometimes. What of that do we need, and what are we missing? What should we prioritize? Also, again, the need for, you know, good learning spaces, and I think that's very important. Before, when we were talking about spaces, it was like, okay, having a nice school, a nice infrastructure, but again, because of the pandemic, now it's more than that. It's having access to water, it's having access to soap, no? So to a good ventilation. So I think the issue of having an appropriate space that promotes learning is even more evident right now. And my last point, I think, is supporting, which is something that Bobby and Patrick both mentioned before, supporting the development of not only digital skills, but also other types of skills like social emotional skills, both for the teachers themselves, so that they know how to deal and to support their students better, but also so that they acquire the right pedagogical practices to help their students develop all those skills.
Well, thank you, Diana. I think that was a perfect way to finish our discussion. I don't know if Bobby or Patrick would like to add something before I go to, you know, the closing remarks.
I think you did a good job. Thank you, Diane.
Perfecto.
Well, thank you. Before parting, I would like to thank the audience for joining this webinar series, our panelists for sharing their experience with us, and all the individuals and departments who contributed to the organization of these webinars for their support and outstanding work. I will also like to take this opportunity to invite you to submit an activity proposal for the EdTech Entrepreneurship track of the International Congress of Educational Innovation before July 30th, as well as participate in Inc. Monterrey 2020, the largest entrepreneurship festival in Latin America. For more information, you can visit the sites displayed on screen. And finally, let me remind you that while this webinar series has ended, the Observatory of Educational Innovation of Tecnológico de Monterrey holds webinars on education every month. The next one titled Meditation to Promote Learning will be held tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. via Facebook. And well, that's all for today. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Bobby. It was a pleasure to hear what you had to say.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank you
having us.
Happy birthday, Bobby. I'm so sorry I forced you to participate in a webinar in your birthday.
Happy birthday, Bobby.
Thank you.
Happy
Like,
birthday.
And Diane, I hope we'll meet in DC.
Definitely. I will email you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Patrick. I'll seeing Maria next week. Bye-bye.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Bobby. Bye, Dana. Thanks, Maria.